From 1861 to 1865, the United States experienced a time period with many casualties and a lot of bloodshed. The Civil War had many leaders. Leading the Confederacy was Robert E. Lee. George B. McClellan was the leader for the Army of Pontomac. McClellan was both a leader on the battlefield and off because he was the opposing candidate running against Lincoln in the election of 1864.
George Britton McClellan was born into an elite family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on December 3, 1826, to Dr. George McClellan and Elizabeth Britton. McClellan studied law at the University of Pennsylvania for 2 years, starting at the young age of 13. His father, who founded Jefferson Medical College, had connections to many people from the Whig Party. When young McClellan decided to abandon law and study military, his father used those connections to get him a spot on West Point.
Ever since a young age, McClellan knew he had a desire to pursue a military career. With his motivation, in 1846, McClellan finished second in a class of 59 students that included future Confederate generals Thomas Jackson and George Pickett. Future generals of both the Union and the Confederate received the same schooling at West Point. Later, this gave McClellan an advantage because he was trained using the same tactics as other generals. However, after their graduation, all of the men went on their own way and direction and had different experiences that would later have an impact during the war. McClellan played a crucial figure during the Mexican War. He was posted to the staff of General Winfield Scott, who was a Whig Party family friend. Winfield Scott advocated recruiting only young men of American birth, intelligence, good character, and above all stature, and through connections gave McClellan an opportunity. On July 1st, 7 weeks after the war's first battles, McClellan received his commission as brevet second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers, and was granted a furlough to be spent in Philadelphia. A furlough is a temporary leave of employees due to special needs of a company, which may be due to economic conditions in a specific employer or in the economy as a whole. As an engineering officer, McClellan often had experience watching and observing combat and eventually was promoted to the rank of captain for showing gallantry under fire. Following the Mexican War, he returned to West Point and continued to serve as an engineer. At the academy, he was selected to be commander of the engineering company. After 3 years at West Point, McClellan was transferred to the western frontier. McClellan's intelligence and ambition caught the eye of future Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Davis secured McClellan an appointment to travel to Europe to study military tactics used in the Crimean War in 1855. Back in the United States, he wrote a cavalry manual and designed the McClellan saddle that remained in use until the 20th century. Although he made some contributions, he lost interest.
By the 1830s, Illinois was eager to boost its own railroad after seeing the growing success of operations along the East Coast. Its growing population had more than tripled since achieving statehood on December 3, 1818, and the Iron Horse appeared to offer limitless potential. With growing power and abilities, it drew for a small bit of time. McClellan abandoned the military in 1857 and became the chief engineer of the newly constructed. With growing power and abilities, it drew for a small bit of time. McClellan abandoned the military in 1857 and became the chief engineer of the newly constructed Illinois Central Railroad. Within 3 years, he became president of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, headquartered in Cincinnati.
The Civil War is where George McClellan's reputation took off. On April 23, 1861, he was appointed Major General of the Ohio Volunteers by Ohio Governor William Dennison. He gained the affectionate nickname of Little Mac for his popularity with the men who served under his command. His men have an immense loyalty towards him. Lincoln, influenced by William Dennison, made McClellan a major general in the regular army, which promoted him to one of the highest-ranked individuals in the service, only under Winfield Scott. He defeated General Irvin of the Confederates at the Battle of First Bull Run, and after that, in the same month, McClellan was placed in command of the Army of the Potomac. Later, in November of 1861, McClellan also became General-in-Chief of all Federal armies upon the retirement of General Winfield Scott. George McClellan was not widely liked by other generals and politicians, often for his rash and lofty behavior, but his men loved and respected him immensely. In spring of 1862, he was removed as General-in-Chief. However, he remained in command of the Potomac Army. In his battles with the Confederacy, he became wary of the Confederate forces, often overestimating their numbers and strength. Because of this, he rarely went on the offensive, often letting the enemy escape, as well as refusing to advance his army. With pressure from Lincoln, though, McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, a campaign against the Confederate capital of Richmond along the Virginia Peninsula. During his campaign, however, he was tricked by the Confederate commander General Joseph E. Johnston multiple times, Johnston creating the illusion that McClellan was facing a larger force than Johnston actually had. McClellan, because of this, frequently delayed his attacks, allowing Johnston time to retreat towards the Richmond defenses. The Confederates then launched the surprise attack of the Battle of Seven Pines. McClellan's army was able to repulse the attacks, but McClellan again delayed further movement. Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee then began an all-out attempt to destroy McClellan's army in the 7 days battle from June 25th to July 1st. Over the course of 7 days' battles, McClellan's army was forced to abandon its goal of seizing Richmond and retreated back to the safety of Washington. As a result of this, Lincoln named Henry Halleck as General-in-Chief of the Army, and the Army of the Potomac was given to General John Pope. Pope, however, was soon defeated at the Battle of Second Manassas, and McClellan ended up leading the Army of the Potomac once again. He soon marched to counter Lee's 1982 invasion of Maryland, his movements much more swift due to a captured document outlining Lee's invasion plan. The two armies eventually met on September 17, 1862, at Antietam, the single bloodiest day of the war. McClellan eventually prevailed, and the wounded Confederate army retreated back into Virginia under the cover of darkness. Although he thwarted Lee's plan, McClellan did not advance to destroy Lee, damaging his career once again. After the battle, a disappointed Lincoln visited McClellan in camp to express his frustration.
Lincoln and McClellan didn't really have a very good relationship. Lincoln's frustration with McClellan, it grew throughout the time that Lincoln was in power. They were together. The South's forces were defeated again and again, and I think it's safe to say the war could have been over if it wasn't for McClellan's hesitation when he was supposed to march forth and destroy his enemy. Lincoln knew that McClellan's army was capable of doing so, yet McClellan, he refused to do more than repulse the attacks and throughout the entirety of his service. And Lincoln went as far as to declare that the first forward march decree ordering all of his armies to move forth, but that didn't even deter McClellan, and he managed to postpone that forward march yet another 2 months. So McClellan was an endless frustration to Lincoln, and their drastically different views on the power of the army, it definitely brought about multiple confrontations between the two of them.
In November of 1802, McClellan was relieved of command and ordered back to New Jersey to await further orders. None ever came. McClellan's overestimate of his enemy's power ended up destroying him.
After McClellan's service in the Civil War, he decided he would run for presidency. The election of 1864 was important because no one knew if Lincoln would win another election. There had not been a wartime election since the War of 1812, when James Madison was elected. Lincoln was reaching his second election, and many were doubting that he would get re-elected due to the Civil War. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place. The Union was not winning any sort of battle. Lincoln couldn't win on either side. The Northern Democrats were appalled to learn that Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation. They felt that Lincoln had turned the Civil War into the conflict of slavery instead of keeping the Union together. At the same time, he couldn't win within his own party, the Radical Republicans, because they believed that the emancipation of slaves was not coming quick enough, and the president's proposal for the readmittance of the Confederate States to the Union was too lenient. Finally, they had won 2 battles, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, so some Union hope was restored. However, the Confederates were slaughtering the Union Army. The 3 big questions between the 2 parties in society were, should the war continue? Should a peace settlement be negotiated? And how would it affect post-war society? Because no one thought Lincoln was a shoo-in for presidency, they decided to choose a candidate to run against Lincoln. They chose Salmon P. Chase because he was an overall good candidate. However, he had created secret pamphlets for private distribution to gain votes. The plan was soon leaked to the press, and his campaign had ended. They then chose John C. Fremont to be the candidate to run against Lincoln. In May, Republicans met in Baltimore to decide the Republican nominee. They voted, and Lincoln had been the candidate who was going to represent the Republican Party. The Democratic Party now had to find their candidate. However, the struggle was the Democratic Party was split. It was split between those who favored the continuation of the war and those who wanted peace. The Copperheads, people in the Midwest, wanted peace. The Copperheads gravitated towards New York City Governor Horatio Seymour to be the Democratic candidate. At the August convention, a deal was struck. McClellan would become the presidential nominee, but the Copperheads were allowed to advocate for peace. Also, the vice president candidate would be Ohio Representative George Pendleton because he was an advocate for peace. McClellan was ideal for the Democrats because he was in the Civil War, so he could connect with the country and share his experiences so they could possibly end the war. Lincoln felt like he wouldn't be able to win this race. But when Union General William T. Sherman captured Atlanta, morale in the North was boosted and many newspapers started to support Lincoln. Lincoln then appeased the radical Republicans by taking out a member of his cabinet who was a conservative. On the other side, McClellan's campaign was suffering because of his thoughts on peace. He tried to play mediator but didn't always work. Even though his party was about peace and ending the war, not everyone always saw it that way. On November 8, 1864, Lincoln had won his second presidential election. Lincoln had won by a landslide. He beat McClellan by more than 500,000 popular votes and by 191 electoral votes. In the end, Lincoln had 212 electoral votes and McClellan only had 21 votes. The only states McClellan won were Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey. During his campaign, it seemed like McClellan was going to win. However, he lost and Lincoln was president once again.
The later years of McClellan's life were a calm counterpart to his military career. He served from 1878 to 1881 as the governor of New Jersey and spent the growing hours of his time writing a memoir, McClellan's Own Story, which was published after his death in 1885 at the age of 58. The legacy following him was not as large as some of the figures he interacted with in his time, like Lincoln. He was remembered after his death as the great organizer of the Potomac, but other than that, and his stubborn attitude, McClellan did not allow himself and his army to make the splash in history that was possible to them.